Welcome back to Final Fantasy IX Translation Analysis, the ongoing series where I compare the game's English translation to the original Japanese script and share some of the most fun and interesting differences with you guys. We're 10 episodes into this, and we're only now getting to meet the last two party members, and, as you might know, one of them even had their name changed in the English translation, which means there's a lot to unpack here, so strap yourselves in and enjoy the ride. After leaving Conde Apata, our heroes finally meet Eiko, who promptly joins our party. Like in English, she talks like a cute and bratty little kid in Japanese as well, but what first-person pronoun does she use? Atashi, maybe? Like Garnet when she was her age? The answer is Eiko. That's right, she talks in the third person, which might seem odd, but it's actually relatively common for little girls in Japanese fiction. So when in English she says, "I wanna be your friend too." In Japanese she says, じゃあ Eiko もお友達になってあげる? Then Eiko will be your friend too. Speaking of being friends, Eiko quickly develops a childish crush on Zidane and starts wondering whether he and Dagger are more than just friends. Zidane confirms that she's right about that because they're not just friends, they're a team. In Japanese, they first use the most common word for friend, tomodachi, and then, when Zidane explains that they're more than that, he says they're nakama. If you've watched fan subs of anime like One Piece, you might be familiar with the particular nuance inherent to this word. While tomodachi is basically a direct equivalent of what we normally mean by friend, nakama can also be translated as friend, but its meaning is more akin to a companion or comrade, as it possesses the nuance of not simply being a friend or acquaintance, but also being like a fellow member of a group or gang. You know, being one of us. So team is a quite serviceable translation that sounds natural in dialogue, and certainly a better option than just leaving the word nakama untranslated. Speaking of being a team, when Zidane tells Eiko he'd like her to come along with them, he and Garnet have the following interaction in English. Why are you so nice to everyone, Zidane? Huh? What do you mean by that? Forget I asked. I think she was mad. You think so too? It's an amusing exchange, but I think Dagger comes off as a little immature here, being seemingly jealous that Zidane is being nice to a 6-year-old little girl who's obviously quite lonely. The Japanese version of the scene also plays into that a little, with Vivi suggesting that Garnet looked not kawaii, but kowai, meaning scary. However, Dagger's lines in Japanese are rather different, and she doesn't say "forget I asked" at all. Here's what she says in Japanese. Jitante. 誰にでも優しいのね. You're kind to everyone, aren't you, Zidane? だが、何か誤解してないか? Dagger, you're not getting the wrong idea, are you? ジタンのそういうところ好きよ. Not at all. I like that about you, Zidane. So you see, the Japanese exchange is a bit different in that while Dagger probably still feels a bit of irrational jealousy, she still acknowledges that the way Zidane shows kindness to all those he meets is an admirable trait of his, and that she likes that about him. And in my opinion, this makes her reaction a little more balanced than in English, where she looks like she's downright sulking out of jealousy. The party then heads towards the place that the dwarves call the sanctuary. In Japanese, the word they use is seichi, whose meaning is made readily apparent by the two kanji that comprise it. Se is the kanji for holy, and chi is the kanji for land. Holy Land would therefore have been a very obvious translation, but for some reason they went with sanctuary. Now the word sanctuary can indeed mean a sacred place, so it still works, but I think Holy Land would have been a better fit, since the word sanctuary kind of evokes images of shrines and churches. You know, man-made places of religious refuge, rather than a natural environment that happens to be considered sacred. Can't help but wonder if the translators didn't go with Holy Land out of fear of offending religious sensitivities. We know that was the case in previous Final Fantasies, when they changed stuff like the holy spell to pearl, but obviously that's not a thing anymore in Final Fantasy IX, so maybe that wasn't the reason here. Whatever the case, Eiko tells Zidane that the Holy Land is actually called the Iifa Tree. And yes, it's Iifa, not Lifa. That's a capital I, not a small L. In Japanese, it's called Iifa no Ki, which just means Iifa tree, but it doesn't use the regular kanji for tree, which is quite simple and common, but a more complex and archaic one, which automatically helps hint at the antiquity of the Iifa tree. Upon reaching the tree, we get its title. In English it says Iifa, the ancient tree of life. This text is lifted directly from the Japanese version of the game, which, as usual, also includes a Japanese title, which reads Iifa, Haha naru Daiju, meaning Iifa, the Great Mother Tree. Inside the tree, the party meets Soul Cage, who calls the Black Mages the Dark Spawn of the Mist in English, which is an accurate description of what they are, but in Japanese he calls them Ankoku no Seimeitai, which literally means life forms of darkness. I don't know which is worse, to be honest. I just know I feel bad for poor Vivi. And so does everyone else, which is why the party beats the crap out of Soul Cage. After which they return to Madain Sari, where we get a pretty romantic scene between Zidane and Garnet. After Zidane tells her that everyone who's joined them had their own reasons for coming along on their journey, Garnet asks him, "Why did you come with me?" Zidane replies with a quote from the story of Ibsen, "Only because I wanted to go with you." This answer retains the meaning of the original Japanese line, but it's phrased in a somewhat different way, which is kind of interesting to analyze. In Japanese, when Garnet asks him, "Why did you come?" he replies with, "Omae ga ikutte ita kara sa," because you said you were going. Like I said, the meaning is essentially the same, but the Japanese line is more, well, Japanese, in that it expresses the sentiment in a more indirect manner, with the speaker's feelings being left implicit rather than made explicit. Instead of saying up front, "I wanted to go with you," he says, "You said you were going." And so he went along simply because he wanted to remain by her side and be with her. But he won't say that outright because in Japanese, people usually aren't that upfront about their feelings and often employ a more subtle form of indirect communication. I'm not saying that makes the Japanese line necessarily better. I like both versions. It's just interesting to note how cultural differences can shape language and change the way certain things are expressed. Anyway, after a beautiful scene where Garnet remembers her forgotten childhood and bonds with Eiko over their common origins, we finally leave Madain Sari, but not before recruiting the 8th and last party member, which brings us to his many names in either version. In English, Lani called him Red. In Japanese, she calls him Homura, which, incidentally, is also the Japanese name of another, quite different, Japanese RPG character, namely Pyra from Xenoblade. Homura means flame, so, like in English, it's a reference to this guy's hair color. The name on his text boxes reads Homura iro no kami no otoko, meaning flame-haired man, which is an actual term in English, so they could have gone with it, but they chose to simply say red-headed man instead, except in battle, where he's called Scarlet Hair. But these are all just temporary aliases before he joins our party and we get to give him a proper name. Or something akin to one anyway. In English, that name is, as you all know, Amarant. But in Japanese, as many of you probably already knew, his name is Salamander. In legends and folklore, salamanders are often associated with the element of fire, so once again the name seems to be a reference to his hair, which is described as possessing the color of flames, and thus he is known by some as the Flaming Salamander. Now, I don't know about you, but I think Salamander is a pretty badass name, and when I found out about it, I didn't understand why they would feel the need to change it in English, but now I realize that, in all probability, it was merely due to the character limit when you get to insert the name of a party member. As I've mentioned before, you can often say a lot more in Japanese than in English with the same number of characters, and the word salamander is no exception. In English, you need 10 characters or letters to write salamander, but in Japanese, you only need 6. Sa, ra, ma, da, a. And so, it just wasn't possible to name him Salamander in English within the game's strict character limit. It's not even the first time this has happened in the series, as this is likely also the reason why they changed, for example, Cayenne to Cayenne or Cyan, and Stragus to Strago in Final Fantasy VI, or even the summon Pandemonium to Pandemona in Final Fantasy VIII. So yeah, they basically had no choice but to come up with a new name for Salamander, and they went with Amarant, presumably based on the name of the plant Amaranth, which often possesses a vivid red hue, and actually kinda looks like his hair. So all in all, it's a pretty sensible and thoughtful localization, considering the limitations they were working with. Oh, and in case you're wondering, Salamander refers to himself with a rough masculine pronoun of ore, just like Zidane. With Amarant added to the group, we finally head to the showdown with Kuja on the Iifa Tree, where Amarant chastises Zidane when the latter is unwilling to leave behind the others in order to climb the trunk so he can reach Kuja. In English he says, "He who hesitates is lost. You'd best remember that." His Japanese line is a bit more specific and relevant to the situation at hand. Leave the dead weight behind. That's an ironclad rule if you want to survive, don't you think? I think this line is more interesting because it does a better job of illustrating Salamander's worldview, and it's also ironic because if Zidane had followed this advice to leave the dead weight behind, then, later on, Salamander would likely have perished in Ibsen's castle. And of course, him saying here that this is an ironclad rule to him sets up nicely his utter bewilderment when Zidane completely goes against it in order to save him. Anyway, Disc 2 concludes with a showdown between our two main antagonists thus far, Kuja and Queen Brahne, and there's some pretty interesting stuff here. As you all know, Kuja is prone to employing theatrical terms, speaking as if life itself were a play and we were all actors on a stage. This is noticeable enough in English, but in Japanese it actually happens even more often. For example, in English he says, "Silver Dragon, let us watch the drama unfold from the trunk of Iifa. No one shall interrupt us there." In Japanese, Kuja literally says that the trunk of the Iifa Tree will be his kangeki no seki, meaning his theater seat, because no wakiyaku, that is, minor or supporting actors, will get in his way there. And this continues. In English, upon seeing Zidane and the others climbing up the trunk, he says, "I'll warm up to them until the elephant lady shows up." Obviously, warming up is an expression related to physical activity and exercising, but in Japanese, Kuja once again employs terms related to theater and drama. Rather than warming up, he says that playing with the zenza, meaning minor performers, will make for a good yokyo, meaning sideshow or opening act. So, as you can see, he frequently employs theatrical terms to express how he sees Zidane and company as having very minor roles or parts in the great drama that Kuja is orchestrating. Especially on this particular occasion where Kuja has his eyes set on Brahne. Likewise, when Brahne arrives on the scene, in English she wastes no time in judging Kuja's effeminate appearance, saying, "Kuja, so you finally decided to show your girly face here." This is pretty funny because in Japanese, Brahne just says, "You finally decided to show yourself," so they added the girly part in English. Which is a pretty minor difference, of course. Unlike Brahne's last words to her daughter while dying, which contain what is easily one of the localization's biggest departures from the original script, because English Brahne is much more repentant in death than Japanese Brahne. In English, her final words to Garnet are, "I led Alexandria down the path of ruin. The people will be happier with you on the throne." In Japanese, however, all she says is, "Watashi wa omou tori ni ikita. Dakara omae mo omae no omou tori ni ikinasai." Which can be translated as, "I lived the way I wanted, so you must also live the way you want." So you see, this is a different kind of change than usual. This isn't a compromise due to the complexity of the translation process, but more of a deliberate choice to change the conclusion of a character and their story. Now, personally, I'm not a big fan of the idea of translators taking such significant creative liberties, but I can sort of see why they might have opted to make this change. The Japanese version could be seen as a little anticlimactic, with Brahne dying without having really learned anything or showing any real remorse for her actions. But on the other hand, you could argue that her change of heart in English feels a little sudden and comes a little out of nowhere, although she is dying, so, you know. Ultimately, it's a question of taste, I suppose, so let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Do you prefer repentant Brahne or unrepentant? And do you prefer Amarant or Salamander? Or maybe you like both versions equally? Either way, that's the end of Disc 2. Wow, can't believe I've done 10 episodes of this already. And with that in mind, if you think this series is pretty cool and deserves more views, then, if possible, share it with a friend or two. It would help the channel grow, and I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, you can also do all that other stuff that you're probably tired of hearing by now, like, subscribe, etc. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, Choco Bros.